August 9th, 1943. A date that captures one of the most profound ironies in American military history. On this day, Major General Terry Allen's face stared out from newsstands across the entire United States. Time magazine the arbiter of American fame and influence, had placed him on its cover. The illustration portrayed a rugged, determined jawline, the face of a conqueror. The article inside was a glowing tribute, praising him as a great division commander in the making, a man who was gaining personal luster and professional renown with each hard-fought victory in the Mediterranean theater. To the American public, reading over their morning coffee, Terry Allen was the embodiment of their hope for victory against fascism. However, there was a devastating discrepancy between the printed page and reality. By the time that magazine hit the stands, by the time the ink was dry and the delivery trucks were rolling, Terry Allen was already unemployed. Just 2 days earlier, in a command tent roughly 4,000 miles away from the celebrating American public, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had fired him. The timing was almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. Allen had just captured Troina in what historians now recognize as one of the bloodiest, most grueling engagements of the entire Sicilian campaign. Under his command, the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red 1, had secured victory in every major battle they fought across the scorching deserts of North Africa and the rugged mountains of Sicily. His men had single-handedly stopped a ferocious German panzer counterattack at Gela that threatened to push the entire Allied invasion force back into the sea. And yet, despite this unblemished record of combat success, Bradley sent him home in disgrace. Why? The official reasons seem trivial compared to the stakes of global war. For discipline problems, for allowing his men to wear sloppy uniforms, for not making his battle-weary soldiers salute properly in the rear echelon. Now, picture the scene. Terry Allen was sitting on a transport ship, watching the coastline of Europe fade into the distance, headed back to the United States in professional exile. At that exact moment, American citizens were picking up magazines that celebrated him as one of the Army's best combat leaders. Think about the cruelty of that timing. Bradley fires the man on August 7th. Time magazine Times lionizes him on August 9th. Bradley had just relieved the very general that America was calling a hero. Politically, that is not a good look. It suggests a disconnect between the high command and the reality on the ground. But the situation was about to get significantly more complicated for Omar Bradley, because sitting in Washington, D.C. was George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall was watching everything. And Marshall was preparing to give Terry Allen something Bradley never expected, and perhaps something Bradley feared, a second chance to prove who was right. To understand why Terry Allen was such a polarizing figure, we have to look at his origins. He arrived at West Point in 1907 with military service woven into his DNA. His father was an Army colonel. His grandfather had fought at Gettysburg in the Garibaldi Guard. For 4 generations, the Allen family had worn the uniform, serving the nation in its darkest hours. But from the moment he stepped onto the grounds of the military academy, Allen was different from the polished, aristocratic cadets surrounding him. He suffered from severe dyslexia, in an era when learning disabilities were neither understood nor accommodated. For Allen, reading was agonizing. The words swam on the page. He compensated with brute force of will, memorizing entire manuals and lectures, but the academic workload was a constant, crushing struggle. The result was a humiliation that would have broken a lesser man. He failed out of West Point, not once, but twice. In the eyes of the institution, he was a washout. Most men would have taken the hint. The Army was telling them, in no uncertain terms, we don't want you. You aren't officer material. Find another career. But Terry Allen possessed a stubbornness that defied logic. He refused to move on. Instead of quitting, Allen enrolled at Catholic University in Washington, completed ROTC, and entered the Army as a commissioned officer through the back door in 1912. This unconventional path marked him permanently. The regular Army officers, the ring knockers from West Point, looked down on him. To them, he was an interloper who hadn't earned his commission the proper way. He wasn't one of them, and they never let him forget it. Allen, for his part, didn't care about their pedigree. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He would spend the next 30 years carrying a chip on his shoulder, driven by a burning need to prove that West Point grades meant absolutely nothing when the bullets started flying and men started dying. World War I provided the first proving ground, transforming Terry Allen into a legend among the enlisted men and a massive headache for his superiors. He commanded an infantry battalion at the remarkably young age of 30. While regulations and prudence dictated that battalion commanders should stay behind the lines to direct the battle, Allen led patrols personally into no man's land. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the deadliest battle in American history up to that point, a machine gun bullet tore through his jaw and teeth. The pain must have been excruciating, the shock debilitating. Most officers would have accepted the medical evacuation ticket home, satisfied that they had done their duty. Not Allen. He talked the doctors into patching him up and sending him back to his unit before the wound had even fully healed. He showed up at the front lines, face bandaged, still bleeding, unable to speak clearly, but ready to lead. His men didn't know whether to be inspired by his bravery or concerned for his sanity. They settled on both. However, his superiors found him impossible to manage. He drank too much, perhaps to numb the physical and psychological pain of war. He ignored regulations he thought were stupid. He treated military ceremony as a waste of valuable time that could be spent on combat training. But there was one undeniable fact that protected him. He won. Every engagement his battalion fought ended in an American victory. After the armistice, Allen returned to the peacetime army, a world of polish and politics that he was ill-suited for. He bounced between cavalry posts, got into trouble, got out of trouble, and built a reputation as the officer you desperately wanted in a bar fight or a foxhole, but nowhere else. He was stagnating. Then, George Marshall noticed him. By 1940, with the world on the brink of fire once again, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen was being chewed out by his regimental commander and facing a possible court-martial for yet another alcohol-related incident. His career seemed to be ending in a whimper. Then, a telegram arrived that shocked everyone. Allen had been promoted to brigadier general, skipping the permanent rank of colonel entirely. It was an unprecedented leap. George Marshall had personally intervened. Why would the chief of staff save a drunk and a troublemaker? Because Marshall was a visionary. He was rebuilding the military for a modern war he knew was inevitable, and he understood a fundamental truth that peacetime bureaucrats missed. He needed killers, not politicians. He needed combat leaders, not parade ground mannequins. Marshall wrote in his personnel file that Allen was outstanding as a leader who could do anything with men and officers, adding the caveat that he was unprepossessing in appearance and apparently casual in manner. Other generals thought Marshall was insane. They saw a man who had failed out of West Point twice. Marshall saw something else. He saw a man who understood that wars were won by soldiers who would follow their commander into the gates of hell, not soldiers who could merely march in straight lines. In May 1942, Marshall gave Allen the ultimate vote of confidence, command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. It was one of the most coveted assignments in the Army, but in receiving this command, Allen was about to collide with the man who would try to destroy his career. Major General Omar Bradley was the antithesis of Terry Allen. Bradley had graduated from West Point near the top of his class. He was methodical, careful, soft-spoken, and obsessed with proper military procedure. He believed that strict discipline and rigid order were the non-negotiable foundations of an effective fighting force. When Bradley took command of 2nd Corps in North Africa, he inherited Allen's 1st Division. What he saw appalled him to his core. The soldiers of the Big Red One didn't salute properly, or sometimes at all. Their uniforms were dirty, modified for comfort rather than regulation. They brawled in rear area towns, drank heavily, and treated military police as enemies rather than authority figures. Bradley wrote with disdain that Allen's division had left a trail of looted wine shops and outraged mayors across North Africa. To Bradley, this lack of discipline was a cancer that would eventually lead to battlefield failure. But here is what Bradley didn't write about in his reports. When the German panzers attacked at Kasserine Pass, a disaster where inexperienced American units collapsed in panic and fled, Allen's division held the line. They stood firm in the face of the blitzkrieg. When I Corps needed to launch a counterattack to regain lost ground, it was Allen's men who led the assault. Even Bradley was forced to admit, though through gritted teeth, that none excelled the unpredictable Terry Allen in the leadership of troops. Think about the subtext of what Bradley was really saying. He acknowledged that Allen was the best combat leader in the Corps, the most effective tool he had against the Nazis. But he also noted that Allen's men didn't salute properly. And to a man like Omar Bradley, the lack of salutes mattered more than the tactical brilliance. It was a clash of philosophies, the belief that form dictates function versus the belief that results justify the means. While the generals argued over discipline, Terry Allen was revolutionizing the way the American army fought. He learned something in the bloody dust of North Africa that would define the rest of his career. Night attacks worked. During the day, the terrain favored the defense. German artillery and dug-in machine guns turned every daylight advance into a suicidal bloodbath. American troops had to cross open ground against veteran defenders who could see every movement. But at night, the mathematical equation of war changed. German gunners couldn't hit what they couldn't see. The terrifying accuracy of the Wehrmacht was nullified by darkness. Allen realized that American infantry could close the distance, sneaking right up to the enemy foxholes before the defenders knew they were coming. He started training his division obsessively in night operations. The Army required a standard 8 to 12 hours of night training per week. Allen threw that schedule in the trash. He demanded 30 to 35 hours a week. His men lived like vampires. They practiced moving in complete, suffocating darkness. They learned to navigate by compass and stars, ignoring landmarks that couldn't be seen. They rehearsed attacks until they could execute complex maneuvers without speaking a single word, using touches and clicks to communicate. The results were immediate and devastating. At El Guitar, Allen's night assaults caught German units completely off guard. The feared 10th Panzer Division was forced to withdraw after taking heavy casualties against American positions they couldn't see to attack. Allen had cracked the code of modern infantry warfare. Bradley watched these victories pile up, but his resentment grew. The discipline problems continued, the brawls, the sloppy uniforms, and so did Bradley's determination to do something about them. In July 1943, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily. George Patton commanded the American 7th Army, while Bernard Montgomery commanded the British 8th. Patton, who valued fighting spirit above all else, specifically requested Allen's 1st Division for the most difficult, dangerous landing at Gela. He knew Allen's men could handle the impossible. They landed on July 10th. Within hours, the situation turned critical. German panzers from the elite Hermann Göring Division counterattacked with 90 tanks, roaring down the hills toward the beaches, trying to crush the Americans before they could unload their heavy equipment. It was a moment of supreme crisis. Allen's division didn't break. They fought tanks with hand grenades, bazookas, and sheer stubbornness. They stopped the German armor in its tracks. Bradley later made an extraordinary admission regarding this battle. He questioned whether any other division in the U.S. Army could have repelled that charge and saved the beachhead. Let that satisfying admission sink in for a moment. Bradley, the man who was plotting to fire Allen, admitted that Allen's division might have been the only unit capable of saving the entire Sicilian invasion from disaster. But Allen wasn't satisfied with just holding the beach. He pushed inland aggressively, cracking the German defensive center to allow Patton's army to race Montgomery toward Messina. His troops were exhausted, caked in dust, and dehydrated. Casualties mounted. Allen drove them harder, knowing that speed saved lives in the long run. On August 6th, after 6 days of brutal, uphill fighting against dug-in fanatics, Allen's division captured the mountain town of Troina. It was one of the bloodiest, most difficult engagements of the entire campaign. The victory at Troina should have been Allen's crowning moment, the pinnacle of his career. Instead, on August 7th, 1943, it became his curtain call. Terry Allen received orders to report to I Corps headquarters. He likely expected a commendation or a discussion on the next phase of the attack. Bradley was waiting for him. The conversation was brief, cold, and professional. Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. So was his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former president. The official reason given was discipline problems and weariness. Bradley stated that Allen had become too much of an individualist to submerge himself in the group undertakings of war. Allen was stunned. He was shell-shocked. His division had just captured Troina. They had won every major engagement in North Africa and Sicily. Now he was being sent home essentially for not making his men salute properly and for loving them too much to badger them about dress codes. He didn't know that Time magazine had already sent their August 9th issue to print with his face on the cover. He didn't know that while he sailed home in disgrace, American newsstands would be celebrating him as a hero. All he knew was that his career was over. The injustice was palpable. George Patton was furious when he learned what Bradley had done. Patton and Allen had argued constantly. They insulted each other over tactics and leadership styles. They were not friends, but Patton recognized a fellow warrior. He knew what Allen had built. Patton had no patience for generals who cared more about salutes than victories. When Eisenhower later gave a lecture criticizing the poor discipline of Allen's division, Patton interrupted him in front of the entire staff. He told Eisenhower he was mistaken and shouted, "No one whips a dog before putting him into a fight." But it didn't matter. Eisenhower backed Bradley's decision. Allen was finished. The men of the 1st Division took the news hard. They weren't just losing a general, they were losing the old man, the guy who had eaten in their mess lines and walked their perimeter wires at night to check on them. Allen boarded a transport ship back to the United States. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man whose heart had been cut out. At 55 years old, the Army had told him he was obsolete. He felt the weight of failure, just like at West Point years ago. But he didn't know that George Marshall was still watching. October 15th, 1943. The scene shifts to Camp Adair, Oregon. Terry Allen stood before a formation of soldiers. But these weren't the battle-hardened veterans of the Big Red One. These were draftees, clerks, farm boys, and recent enlistees who had never heard a shot fired in anger. This was the 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves. George Marshall had intervened again. Just 2 months after Bradley declared Allen unfit to command, Marshall gave him a 2nd Division. Think about that time frame. 2 months. Bradley fires the guy, and before the paperwork is even dry, Marshall hands him another army. Marshall's message was clear. He didn't care what Bradley thought about salutes. He didn't need a diplomat or a disciplinarian. He needed a brawler who could win battles. Allen looked at the raw troops in front of him and saw potential where others saw green recruits. He decided he would build this division from nothing. He would train them in the specific tactics that had terrified the Germans in North Africa and Sicily. And, perhaps most importantly, he would prove to the world that Omar Bradley had made the worst personnel decision of the war. The training began that afternoon, and it was brutal. Allen transformed the 104th Division into something the Army had never seen before. He immediately reinstated the punishing regimen he had perfected in North Africa. While standard divisions trained for daylight operations, the Timberwolves lived in the dark. They learned to move through forests without flashlights. They practiced hand signals that worked when voices would give away positions. They rehearsed attacks until every soldier knew exactly where to be without being told. Allen was ruthless about discipline now, but it was times combat times discipline, not parade discipline. He drove his men to the breaking point, but this time it wasn't just about winning battles. It was personal. Every successful night drill was a silent rebuke to the superiors who said he was undisciplined. He was forging the Timberwolves into a weapon that Omar Bradley would eventually have to respect. The Timberwolves adopted a motto: "Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves." By August 1944, they were ready. Allen loaded his division onto transport ships bound for France. He was going back to war, and he was bringing the night with him. The 104th Division entered combat on October 23, 1944, in the Netherlands. The conditions were miserable: freezing rain, flooded lowlands, and mud. Allen attacked at night. His Timberwolves advanced 15 miles in 5 days through flooded terrain that had stalled other divisions for weeks. Montgomery himself sent congratulations on the speed of the advance. Then they hit the Siegfried Line. This was the German border defense system: concrete pillboxes, dragon's teeth tank traps, interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Other divisions had bled themselves white, attacking these defenses in daylight, getting cut to pieces by accurate German fire. Allen's men changed the script. They attacked at night, again and again. Stolberg fell, then Eschweiler, then Inden. Town after town was captured in darkness while German defenders struggled to organize resistance against enemies they couldn't see. The psychological impact on the Germans was devastating. They were used to fighting Americans who stopped at sunset. Allen's men didn't stop. They smashed across the Rohr River in a brutal night assault. And finally, they reached the major city of Cologne. The Germans started calling the 104th the Night Fighters, or times Die Nachtjäger **. Prisoners told interrogators that fighting them was unfair. "We couldn't see the Americans coming," they said. The normal rules didn't seem to apply. By the spring of 1945, Allen's division had crossed the Rhine and was racing toward the Elbe River. They had become exactly what Allen promised Marshall they would be: the most feared night fighting unit in the European theater. They were a machine of war, precise and deadly. But then, they found something that would haunt them forever. On April 11th, 1945, the 104th Division reached Nordhausen. They expected another town to clear, another fight. Instead, they found a concentration camp. The scene was apocalyptic. 3,000 corpses lay in the open, rotting in the spring sun. Another 750 survivors, emaciated, sick, and dying, had been left behind when the SS fled. These prisoners had been forced to build V-2 rockets in vast underground tunnels, worked to death in darkness, then discarded like trash when their usefulness ended. For 6 months, the Timberwolves had owned the night. They had used darkness as a shield and a weapon. But at Nordhausen, they stared into a different kind of abyss. This wasn't the darkness of a moonless battlefield. It was the darkness of the human soul. Battle-hardened sergeants who hadn't flinched under artillery fire broke down and wept at what they found in those tunnels. The smell of death was overwhelming. Allen's night fighters had mastered the art of warfare, but nothing in their 35 hours of weekly training had prepared them for the industrial scale of extermination. They shifted gears immediately, evacuating the survivors for medical treatment and ordering local German civilians to bury the dead, forcing them to confront the crimes committed in their name. The division's war had barely 2 weeks left after that horror. The Timberwolves pushed east with a cold, righteous fury. On April 26, 1945, the 104th Division reached the Mulde River and made contact with Soviet forces. They were among the first American units to link up with the Red Army. The handshake at the river marked the end. The war in Europe was effectively over. The statistics of Allen's redemption were staggering. The Timberwolves had fought for 195 consecutive days. In all that time, they had never yielded a single foot of ground to a counterattack. They had never failed to take an assigned objective. The division that had been handed to Terry Allen as a consolation prize, composed of green draftees, a far cry from the elite regulars of the Big Red One, had become one of the most effective fighting units in the entire war. German prisoners consistently rated the 104th among the American divisions they least wanted to face. The night fighters had earned their reputation in blood, but the cost had been enormous. Nearly 5,000 Timberwolves were casualties. Over 1,000 were killed in action. Allen, who felt every loss personally, wrote hundreds of letters to the families of men who died under his command. Each letter was personal, not a form letter. Each one acknowledged the specific sacrifice of a son or husband. Omar Bradley never publicly admitted he was wrong about Terry Allen. He went on to become a 5-star general, maintaining his belief in strict discipline. But George Marshall's judgment had been completely vindicated. The general who appeared on Time magazine's Times cover 2 days after being fired had just led his 2nd Division to absolute victory. The troublemaker who failed out of West Point twice had built the most feared night fighting unit in the European theater. In the end, the story of Terry Allen is not just about battles and tactics. It is a story about the clash between the system and the individual. Bradley believed that the system won wars. Allen believed that the spirit of the soldier won wars. Bradley had said Allen was too much of an individualist for coalition warfare. Standing on the banks of the Mulde River, surrounded by his victorious Timberwolves, Terry Allen had proven once and for all that sometimes individualism is exactly what is needed to win.